Along the north shore of the St. Lawrence River lies the oldest part of settled Canada. In 300 years, the dense forest, once the domain of the voyageurs and the coureurs de bois, has given way to closely settled farmlands. Some of these have been tilled for 7 and 8 generations. But winter snows reveal that in 300 years, the farms have crept back from the river barely 10 miles. Though man has brought the wilderness under his hand, the frontier is never very far away. Beyond the big cities and settled farms of Canada, north of the old towns and the great railroads, lies a land where men are still pioneers. Harsh ribs of rock cutting the clear sky enfold sparkling blue lakes. Among the rocks lie stretches of jagged spruce bordering spongy muskegs. Artists early felt the call of this frontier land. The first to paint it were schooled in the traditions of the old world, steeped in its mannerisms. The paintings of Cornelius Krieghoff, who died in 1872, give a charming and accurate picture of manners and customs, but the treatment is European. Then men like Maurice Cullen began to look at Canada through Canadian eyes, and in the years before the First Great War, a group of young Canadians sounded a new note. That note is expressed in The Jack Pine by Tom Thomson. This picture, painted in broad, bold strokes, shows a deep affection for Canada's frontier country, its loneliness and its beauty. Others followed Thomson. J.E.H. MacDonald in The Solemn Land shows a poet's feelings for the rolling hills of Algoma. In September Gale, Arthur Lismer paints the howl of the westerly as it lashes the Georgian Bay. Lauren Harris struck a somber note with the gaunt beauty of bare rock and twisted stump above Lake Superior. Like all artists, these men owed much to tradition, but they spoke with a new voice, the voice of Canada. A foundation member of the group, and foremost among those who spoke in this new way, is Alexander Young Jackson. Born in Montreal in 1882, he is today the leading Canadian landscape painter. He has traveled from the whaleback rocks of Georgian Bay to Baffinland and up to the Arctic. He has sketched in Halifax and in the fishing villages of the Gaspé along the Gulf of St. Lawrence, where houses cling to the steep cliffs. In doing so, he has produced his own essence of Canada, vast, rhythmic, vigorous. Jackson lives in the studio building in Toronto. A wealthy fellow artist put up the building for the painters of a generation ago who were searching for something new to say. Here Jackson works among the tools of his trade, his easel, his paints and brushes, his canvases. Around him are souvenirs of his lifelong search into the meaning of the Canadian landscape. Jackson's hours are professionally regular. He rises at 7:30 and breakfasts in the shack where Thomson worked in the winters of 1914 to 16. It is still called Tom's Shack. His companion is Keith McKeever, a Scots mining prospector who knows Canada's North Country like his own hand. But the studio is only a part of Jackson's life, for he belongs in the open with the landscapes he paints. One of his favorite sketching grounds is northern Ontario, which he visits in the fall. At Grace Lake, a small mountain tarn just above the Georgian Bay, he has done some of his best work. In October, he packs his brushes, paints, and birch sketching panels and heads north. He looks more like a bushman than a painter, for the best country lies many miles from settlement, and the artist must be able to wield a paddle as well as a brush. At the far end of Cranberry Lake, there's a 3/4-mile portage. As the two men lift the canoe and hoist the duffel onto their backs, they see that the color is good. But red maple and yellow birch and poplar will be bare skeletons in 2 weeks. So once they have pitched camp on the edge of Grace Lake, deep in the La Cloche Hills, Jackson leaves the running of the camp to McKeever and gets to work preparing his sketch box for a day's wandering through the bush. First comes the search for something to paint, the motif, as artists call it. On some days it may come quickly, but on others, Jackson may wander for hours before finding exactly what he wants. Now comes the great adventure. The artists tussle with nature to select only the core of what he sees. Each painting is a fresh problem, yet each problem must be tackled in the same way. For the artist's job is to examine the pattern of nature and then to get at its basic design. He must instantly grasp its inner structure of line and mass. With his brush, he must clear away the bric-a-brac, eliminate what is unnecessary. Like the musician, the artist takes a theme, the curve of a rock, the line of a hill, and builds it into a design by the use of contrasting themes of color, light, and shape. He sees an accidental grouping of rocks, a pattern of trees along the lakeshore, and he makes that pattern important to us by stripping it down until we see in it the essence of all rocks and trees. It is work of intense concentration, for it is really research into the structure of what we see. But from the painter's rich chords of color, crimson for maples, viridian for spruce, blue and madder for rocks and sky, comes an entirely fresh statement about the scene that caught his eye. Jackson has made such a statement about the Canadian North. He has caught the sluggish rhythm of the oldest hills in the world.
When I'm making a sketch, I try to emphasize the things I want and ignore the things I don't want. I like to think of a sketch not as a little picture, but rather as an idea for a big one. A close resemblance to the subject is only a minor virtue. You may try to get an effect of light or an arrangement of color or certain relationships of form and line, but what you always strive for is an intensification of nature. So often the northern landscape is a crowded confusion of shapes and colors, and you have to reduce it to some kind of order. A tree sticking up in the center is better moved to the side. There is a flicker of blue on the little lake. You make it into a generous space. Anything you need you will find, but you must sense the need of it. The artist in front of nature does not think only of composition or of form and tone and color. On the contrary, when you are on the alert, such things become instinctive. And it is surprising how quickly you can make decisions in sketching under pressure of changing weather, shifting shadows, and other difficulties. The final canvas, if there is ever to be one, will not be judged by its likeness to the scene which inspired it. Just imitating nature was never the artist's intention. Whether you take nature itself or the perfect replica by photography, either one remains the same starting point. From this starting point, the painter must select and create his own interpretation of the scene.
So another problem has been solved, and back at the camp, the sketch joins a rapidly growing pile. When winter comes, Jackson will use some of them for canvases. In the early spring, Jackson makes his annual trip down to Quebec. His painting ground lies near the village of Saint-Tite-Cap, perched high on the hills overlooking the lower St. Lawrence. He leaves the land where man is still something of a stranger for the land where man has lived for 300 years and more. In April, when winter frosts loosen their grip and the sun climbs higher over the rounded contours of the snow-covered hills, he finds the subjects for some of his best-known canvases. Typical is the barns. Each morning he prepares his sketch box and dons snowshoes for a tramp over the deep snow in search of something to paint. He is a familiar figure in these parts. Père Raquette, the Abiton farmers call him, Father Snowshoe. In such weather, Jackson works fast, for the chilly air may thicken up his paint, making it too stiff for use. But once again, his job is to simplify, to get the essentials of the landscape into sharp focus. He quickly catches the shifting forms and colors and sets them down in rich strokes of blue, madder, and white. The Quebec country is superb. Fences give another pattern to the rolling contour of the hills. In the early spring light, the subtle blues and pinks emerge more clearly from the deep snow. But Jackson's essence of Quebec is in sharp contrast to his sketches of the North Country. He gives us here the broad sweep of rounded hills and weaves into them the pattern of man's handiwork, sharp accents of farmhouses in the valley, and over all, the peace of the land and its people waiting for the warm spring sun. As evening falls, Jackson returns to the home of Joseph Tremblay. Here he relaxes with his French-Canadian friends over a game of pique-dame. Back at the studio in Toronto comes another problem, building up a new design on a large canvas, working to transform the pattern of the sketch into a new order. As he puts in his underpainting, Jackson prepares for changes. This is another job. He will not imitate the sketch. Each stroke of the brush brings alterations, and it is in watching the brush at work that we see how the painter transmits to the canvas the sense of beauty that is in him. The way a man wields a brush, the way he applies color, are as individual as handwriting and just as revealing. For it is only by constant change and development that the artist can give us exactly what he wants us to see. It is only by continual research that Jackson can get into his paintings the essence of the landscape he saw. It may be the fishing villages along the south shore of the St. Lawrence where men gain a hard living from the sea. It may be the gaunt hills that lie far to the north of the Arctic Circle. In every picture is a simple statement, richly painted, of the structure of the Canadian scene. And that is what people feel when they look at his canvases. This essence of Canada lies also in Jackson's earlier paintings. The subtle tones of night Georgian Bay, where subdued blues and greens give us the ghostly atmosphere of moonlight. Red maple with its bright reds and whites and its bold accent on detail. The feeling of endless space in Northland Hilltop. Early spring Quebec, where the old hills throw up a rampart behind the ancient farmlands. And so, though he works a 10-hour day in the studio, it is in the open that Jackson belongs, out in the vast hinterland which has challenged him as it has all Canadian painters. From the United States border to the North Pole, from the cliffs of Labrador to the Pacific and Alaska, the great subcontinent of Canada stretches out. The weathered farms of the old province of Quebec, the endless expanse of the great western prairies, the tangled peaks of the Rocky Mountains. Above all, the silent barrens that lie beyond the fringe of settled Canada. Jackson has reacted to this landscape, putting down in paint what many feel, but few can ever express. But the landscape is endless in its variety, and it remains as a challenge to the painters of each generation, a vast, unsentimental land.